I am very pleased to narrate for you this remarkable story by the fiction writer Maxwell Conroe, full of pranks and surprisingness, titled Newtonian Dream. Although Isaac Newton died some 300 years ago, Maxwell revives him in a story where Newton's portraits are vandalized, and Newton himself is seen fleeing from hooligans running across the hallways of the Royal Society covered in tar and feathers. This story, Newtonian Dream, first appeared in Conroe's story bundle titled Magic Musings, and here is how it starts. Part 1. Daydreaming. A dear friend of mine uniquely portrayed what she experienced reading my stories. Wrapping her palms around her head, she said, "Boom," moving her hands away to visualize the detonation of a pressure charge. To me, it seems your head, being so overfull with all these ideas, must be frequently exploding. I told her, yes, that is exactly how I feel, and for me, there is no escape from it. In fact, when I sleep, I suffer even more. Nay, that's too negatively portrayed. A creative mind is both a joy and a burden. Sometimes the visions are uplifting and cheerful, but other times they are dreadful, and most times my visions tend to be a mixture of both. For example, after reading a detailed book about the animosity between Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, and Robert Hooke, 1635 to 1703, my mind started to stitch together some bizarre images by combining the new information of Hooke's run-ins with Newton with animosity I already knew had occurred between Newton and Godfrey Leibniz, 1646 to 1716. Let me tell you my story that I think I have dreamed. Or maybe it actually happened for real. Part 2. Tarring and feathering. Well, let's assume it was only a dream. Can you imagine that I saw how Hooke and Leibniz were chasing Newton across the corridors of the Royal Society of London? That prestigious institution was founded in 1660, and now, in its posh corridors, Newton appeared gruesomely covered in tar and feathers. In their pursuit and desire to tarnish Newton's legacy, Hooke and Leibniz were joined by Freeman Dyson, who was, technically speaking, born in 1923, long after his comrades, and, unlike them, he had passed only recently, in 2020. Dyson has been a fellow at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies and became somewhat of an intellectual socialite. He frequently appeared in the media to comment on where the world was heading, jabbing at his peers and always smirking mischievously when he did so. And now Dyson appeared in my vision, pillaging with great vigor the premises of the Royal Society. I clearly saw him pulling down a huge portrait of Newton, the famous one where Isaac was only 46 years old, painted by Godfrey Kneller in 1689. Dyson also tore down a second frame with Newton's image where he was 60 years old, also painted by Kneller in 1702. Kneller's 1702 painting of Newton very closely resembled a portrait posture of Louis XIV in a 1701 painting by Hyacinthe Rigaud, of which hundreds of copies were made for dissemination throughout France and beyond to display his splendour and to ensure that everyone would know whom was France's rightful ruler. And for Isaac Newton, the paintings of him by Kneller did much the same. These portraits helped spread Newton's fame, especially when numerous etches and painted copies of the original, painted by Kneller, were disseminated throughout the Western world. Newton's image as a scientific genius was immortalized. Dyson, in his mad frenzy, slammed the two versions of Newton's paintings into the marble floor, smashing the frames to smithereens in a very methodical way. When the canvases came loose from their frames, Dyson tore what was left into shreds. I myself too joined in the rampage, but was at first unsure what part I was to play. Nonetheless, I brazenly toppled over a random bronze head and heard it crashing into the marble floor behind me, which made me pause and think why I was doing this. Part 3. Feuding. At that very moment, and before I could find any plausible answer to my private doubt, Leibniz and Hooke reappeared in the hallway of the Royal Society chambers. Although Isaac Newton is still considered a brilliant scientist by many modern admirers of his scientific work, Sir Robert Hooke and Herr Godfrey Leibniz would not agree with this adulation. According to both Hooke and Leibniz, Newton was nothing short of an evil genius. He had allegedly appropriated their findings without proper acknowledgement of their major contribution as the original discoverers. What further had happened to Newton was erstwhile not clarified in my dream, but I saw Hooke energetically joining Freeman Dyson to systematically demolish what was left of Newton's two portraits. They even tried to set the canvas shreds ablaze with a candle. Leibniz, for his part, directed all his attention to another gentleman that he presented to me as his patron, Prince Guelph. In fact, the prince was arguing with Leibniz about his legacy and claimed the scientist, Leibniz that is, had defrauded his family of funds availed for family tree research. The work on the family tree was never completed by Leibniz, and Prince Guelph scolded the famous scientist Godfrey Leibniz for betraying his trust. As all these skirmishes played out in one of the corridors of the Royal Society, Robert Hooke came running past us looking for water buckets. He said the little firebrand was getting out of control. I noticed Hooke's shirt was covered in bloodstains, which did not bode well for the fate Newton had met. Dyson, apparently no longer interested in the smouldering ashes of Newton's portraits, walked over to us, asking Leibniz if he needed some help. But then Dyson changed his demeanour when learning the name of Leibniz's patron was Prince Guelph, the heir of a noble family with a long aristocratic lineage. The prince now declared that he wanted the Royal Society to form a committee to review the agreement between the Guelph family and Leibniz. He wanted the committee to compare the pledged deliverables with what Leibniz had actually given to the family as work for hire. Then Dyson suddenly decreed that this review he would immediately assign to an impartial person, and he pointed towards me. Part 4. Retained. Of course, I knew very well the story of how Leibniz had benefited tremendously from his retained position as the Guelph court's chronicler of the family pedigree. Prince Guelph had practically financed all of Leibniz's endeavours. It was easy to see that it was not in fact the Guelph family who was defrauded by Leibniz. It was none of the sort. No, instead it was the common man who had been tirelessly toiling away to provide the coins to the Guelph family, which had extracted steep taxes from the common man. Only a fraction of these ill-gotten proceeds was skimpily passed on to Leibniz to enable him to complete his scientific pursuits. For decades, Leibniz had somehow managed to continually appease the expectations of his employer, whom he strung along with excuses of more work being needed to reach the final goal. But in the end, he never finished his assumed main task, which was to write a historical treatise on how the Guelph family was destined to rise to power over Saxony. In fact, the emergence of the state of Saxony and the rise to power of the Guelph family had never been of any real interest to Leibniz, and being the gifted idiosyncratic thinker he was, the scope of Leibniz's dynastic reconstruction would grow ever broader. He would write long treatises about questions like how life on Earth came about and when life emerged first on it. This, Leibniz claimed, was necessary to establish a firm foundation for the later volumes, in which he pledged to provide a compelling narrative and solid reasoning for the ultimate outcome of a long, historic series of events, namely that the Guelph dynasty and no others were destined to become the inevitable and rightful rulers of Saxony. Cunningly, and being from humble origins, Leibniz constantly needed financing patronage to facilitate his research endeavours, which is why he readily accepted all kinds of assignments, even from other benefactors, while being on the payroll for the Guelph family. But in all truth, I think Leibniz never intended to really complete the work that he was originally hired for. He rather skillfully managed to string along his employer with grandiose promises, and instead continued to pursue his private agenda with undiminished fervour, covering a wide range of research topics and business schemes. Part 5. Inquiry for Review. I was rudely woken up out of my thoughts and found Freeman Dyson pulling at my shirt. He even violently shook my right arm. "Will you do it?" he screamed. Obviously he was referring to as whether I would accept to conduct the review assignment or chair a committee that was to do the same. The task ahead would be to review the professional conduct of the German philosopher Godfrey Leibniz as he had navigated through life and manoeuvred in his endeavours while balancing his relationship to pursue the interests of the Guelph family. Had Leibniz possibly behaved in an unprofessional way in his dealings with his main sponsor? I quickly realised that there was no possible honour to be gained from such a review. But how could I withdraw in a dignified manner from my assignment? Here I had won my little stroke of genius. I decided to try to reframe the assignment Dyson was apparently keen on burdening me with. "Why," I spoke, "should we waste precious time, and no less so the noble prince's precious resources, on a review of past business dealings? Would it not be possible to, instead, make sure the pursuit of establishing the required dynastic chronicle of Saxony's rulers will be completed without undue delay?" I daringly and rather bluntly suggested who could do the task. For example, Robert Hooke would be the preeminent person to undertake such a task. As one of the co-founders of the Royal Society, few people have more clout, knowledge and wisdom than Sir Robert Hooke. But of course, if my dear friend Hooke is tied up in other pressing matters, I'm sure we can fittingly find other eminently qualified scientists to oblige. Part 6. Newtonian Snob. At this moment, something unexpected happened. Newton came running back across the corridor. Somehow he had managed to shed the tar and feather costume. He was instead adorned with the same wig as shown in his official 1602 portrait, the very same portrait that I had just seen being so thoroughly demolished by Freeman Dyson himself, leaving nothing but a heap of smithereens and smouldering shreds of the canvas. Newton, for his part, plainly ignored all present except for the prince, and immediately injected himself into the conversation and directly addressed Prince Guelph. "My dear Prince, more than anyone I can understand your frustration with the services of Mr. Leibniz. Everyone knows it was I who invented differential notation to quantify nature's behaviour, such as, for example, gravitational acceleration. My Principia, first published in 1686, clearly exposed the use of these new principles of mine. Mr. Leibniz wasted so much of your Count's valuable time by making unfounded claims as to my address about prior uses of differential calculus by him. It's preposterous. As for Hooke, everyone already knows that I invented the law of gravity and gravitational attraction. This is also explained from basic principles in my Principia. I do not recommend Hooke's services to your noble family, given that Hooke wasted much of his time claiming that he, and not I, was the rightful inventor of the law of gravity. We all know his attempts fell far short of developing proof for such a law. He constantly keeps referring to a 1674 note, while claiming the law of gravity was his invention. This note I have indeed studied very carefully, but it can be merely considered as a supposition of sorts, due to lack of underlying proof." Newton, shrewd and mean, conveniently left out the fact that he had, early on, engaged with Hooke in several discussions regarding the law of gravity, long before the Principia had finally appeared in first print. An uncomfortable pause occurred in the ongoing conversation because Newton, full of himself as he was, had painfully forgotten to resolve how the Guelph family could be relieved from their grievance over Leibniz's conduct. All that Newton had done, like so many times before during his lifetime, was bring discredit to the names of Hooke and Leibniz, his principal adversaries. Part 7. Freeman's Assignment. At just that very moment strode into view a familiar silhouette. Rudolf Steiner entered the premises. He winked Freeman Dyson to join the conversation. "Freeman," he said with his heavy German accent, "were you not saying you were utterly bored in heaven? I had told you this would happen if not snooping around regularly in heaven well before your death to make sure you knew what you were getting into. This has been my anthroposophic advice to anyone interested in coming to terms with higher beings and the meaning of being, well, dead. So, my dear Freeman, I think you, being so bored being dead that now you even join the marauders in smashing Newton's portraits, owe a significant debt to the Royal Society we all hold in such high esteem. What better way can there be to redeem your debt and kill your boredom all at once, engaging with the task so important at this moment in time? Will you please consider accepting our sincere invitation and due honor to help us write the ultimate genealogy and history of the rise to power in the Kingdom of Saxony by no others than the gifted and well-endowed with talents members of the Guelph dynasty?" Freeman Dyson had no choice, because Newton immediately grasped his hand and shook it violently, congratulating him with his new assignment and giving, as the most prominent president of the Royal Society, his full support and endorsement to the undertaking. Meanwhile, Hooke and Leibniz had already stealthily left the premises, and Prince Guelph's face beamed with pride and happiness over the soon-to-be restored glory of his family. This explains why today in the library of the Royal Society one can find 43 thick volumes, all authored by Freeman Dyson, resulting from his diligent execution of the royal task to document the rise of the House of Guelph, sovereign rulers of Saxony. I have now narrated to you my recurrent Newtonian dream, for which I have sought help from a psychiatrist. She gave up on me. Her name is Helena. She always wears a green jacket. The other psychiatrist I am seeing is a guy who always wears a red jacket. That's how I can tell my shrinks apart in an instant. But let me not take more of your precious time and cease troubling you with my private travails.